Good day, everybody. Welcome back to Rocky Mountain Readings, where we've been reading the beautiful book Providence and Power, 10 Portraits in Jewish Statesmanship by Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. And Shalom Sheila, so glad to have you with us as always. And we finished off last Wednesday. We were in the middle of Louis D. Brandeis, who was the first Jewish person appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States. Interesting material for sure. So let's just continue from where we left off. I will do my best to try and finish today, but I may seem rushed. Let's start right here. There is among the leading Jews a great feeling of antagonism towards Brandeis because his present superlative and extreme Judaism is a plant of very late growth. He, Taft's source, says that Brandeis was no Jew until he was rejected by Wilson as Attorney General. Since that time, Brandeis has adopted Zionism, favors the New Jerusalem, and has metaphorically been recircumcised. There is more along the same scurrilous lines coming from Taft, a pillar of American culture, rectitude, and later himself as austere Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The charge would be amusing, even if true, but it was also wrong, or perhaps we might say that Taft misjudged the facts. The change in Brandeis was not calculated but sincere, and upon ascending to the court, after contentious hearings that dragged on for an unprecedented 4 months, he duly resigned his official position in the Zionist movement. Yet his friendship with Woodrow Wilson and his lobbying and activism on behalf of Zionism continued in May 1917, in the early months of Wilson's second term. Britain's new foreign minister, Arthur Balfour, paid a visit to Washington. The wartime British cabinet, at the urging of Chaim Weizmann and others, had been discussing the role in the Zionist future that Britain might play as a result of its intended wresting of the Holy Land from the hand of the Ottoman Empire, a victory that would be achieved by the end of that year. Desiring to know whether Wilson would support the establishment of a future Jewish home in Palestine, Balfour sought out Washington's most prominent Jew and most public Zionist. Following an initial meeting between the two men, Justice Brandeis made his way to the White House for a chat with the president. At a second meeting with Balfour, as Gross describes, Brandeis was able to promise Wilson's wholehearted support, including his readiness to speak out in public at the appropriate time. Departing for London, Balfour reflected that Brandeis was probably the most remarkable man he had encountered on the trip, and someone to whom he himself had opened up and announced in all candor, "I am a Zionist." Gross notes the striking peculiarity of this series of events. As an illustration of back-channel diplomacy at its most effective, the Balfour-Brandeis encounter was exceptional. A foreign minister seeking understanding on a delicate political issue turned not to his official opposite number, the Secretary of State, or even to the other foreign policy advisors known to be close to the president. He sought out instead a member of the judiciary having neither official nor unofficial standing in the matter, but a deep personal interest, and the sympathetic ear of the president. Brandeis, for his part, saw no impropriety in discussing a humane philanthropic issue. In London, Brandeis' assurance of Wilson's support could not have come at a more crucial moment, or at a more delicate one. For as Rick Richmond notes in his new book, "And None Shall Make Them Afraid, 8 Stories of the Modern State of Israel Encounter," when the British cabinet met to discuss a draft declaration on Palestine, Edwin Montagu, the only Jew in the government, spoke vehemently against Zionism and circulated a passionate anti-Zionist memorandum to the cabinet. Edwin Montagu, largely forgotten today, was once the most politically important Jew in England. Like many of the members of the British Jewish aristocracy known as the cousinhood, he hated Zionism and its notion that Jews around the world were one people and bound to each other, an idea that to his mind not only was false but also opened Jews to the charge of dual loyalty. To Britain's Prime Minister Lloyd George, Montagu complained that all my life I've been trying to get out of the ghetto. You want to force me back there? There were quite a number of prominent British Jews favorable to the Zionist project, including Montagu's cousin Herbert Samuel, who in 1920 would become Britain's High Commissioner for Palestine. Yet at the very moment that the Zionist future was being decided, Montagu wielded the greatest influence, as he made known his opposition to the draft of what would become known as the Balfour Declaration, indicating formal British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Chaim Weizmann reached out to Brandeis asking if President Wilson and yourself would support the text. Brandeis, Richmond writes, wired Weizmann based on his talks with Wilson. The president was in entire sympathy with the draft declaration. And in mid-October, Wilson himself passed a private message to the British supporting the declaration, which was issued 2 weeks later. Shalom Explorer Torah, Tanakh. That private message, Weizmann wrote later, was one of the most important individual factors in breaking the deadlock. To Nahum Goldman, later president of the World Zionist Organization, without Brandeis' efforts, the Balfour Declaration would probably never been issued. Very important point. Montagu was crushed. It seemed strange, he reflected bitterly in the aftermath, to be a member of a government which goes out of its way, as I think, for no conceivable purpose that I can see, to deal this blow at a colleague that is doing his best to be loyal to them, despite his opposition. The government has dealt an irreparable blow to the Jewish Britons and has endeavored to set up a people which does not exist. Yeah, interesting points, especially if you're from the UK. The irony or the providential teaching of this moment is hard to miss. One of the most important Jews in England had done all he could to deny Jewish peoplehood and to stop the Zionist project, only to be foiled by one of the most important Jews in America, who only several years earlier had thought about his own Jewishness in exactly the Montagu model. In a 1964 essay, Confrontation, Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik pointed to the way that in the book of Genesis, Abraham introduces himself to the men of Canaan. I am a stranger and a neighbor among you. The theological point parallels the political point made by the contrasting tales of Edwin Montagu and Louis Brandeis, namely that Jewish identity is itself hyphenated, in that the Jews are obligated to be loyal citizens of the country in which they live, as well as loyal members of their divinely summoned covenant, and to serve them both. Yeah, definitely a tough task to juggle. In Rabbi Soloveitchik's words, we Jews think of ourselves as human beings sharing the destiny of all persons and simultaneously as members of a covenantal community which has preserved its identity under the most unfavorable conditions. We believe we are summoned by God to undertake a double mission, the universally human and exclusively covenantal. Very, very, very important point. Over the centuries, intensifying in modernity, untold numbers of Jews have rejected this double mission. Edwin Montagu in 1917 was one of them. So was Louis Brandeis in 1905 and again in 1910. Rabbi Soloveitchik almost seems to be speaking about the two of them when he writes further. The emancipated modern Jew has been trying for a long time to do away with this twofold responsibility, which weighs heavily upon him. The westernized Jew maintains that it is impossible to engage in both the universal and the covenantal, which in his opinion are mutually exclusive. Montagu took ill in 1924 and died at the age of 45, having failed to achieve the apex of political power in Britain and having failed again in his assault on Zionism. Yet his legacy, too, lives on, in specifically the number of Jews today who express concern for the nationalist aspirations of all peoples except their own. It's a very big point. And who raise against their Zionist opponents the spectral charge of dual loyalty. Louis Dembitz Brandeis was once also such a Jew, and but for a casual conversation on Cape Cod, such a Jew might have remained. Although he never embraced the religious observance that he had witnessed in his Uncle Louis's life, the later inspiration led him to reconfigure his own sense of identity. Meanwhile, Brandeis's Uncle Louis Dembitz may be as unknown today as Edwin Montagu, if not more so, but one can rightly say that millions of Jews enjoy the fruits of Dembitz's life and labor every day in vibrant and miraculously reborn Jewish state. For this reason alone, the Brandeis tale ought to inspire Jewish Americans the ambition to be known at once for their dedication to the country and for exercising their freedom simultaneously in defense of their fellow Jews and in dedicated observance to the faith of their fathers. No great or even small ingathering of Jews came to Ararat, Mordecai Manuel Noah's proto-Zionist experiment. In calling upon the Jews to leave Europe for America and the Holy Land, he was a man before his time. Louis Brandeis was a man of his time, one who, at the moment he was most needed, embraced the cause of his time. But in so doing, his newfound description of American Jewish identity uncannily paralleled by American Jewish figures in the previous generations. Some might say that Brandeis helped fashion American Jewish identity as it is today, but in a deeper sense, he did not so much shape or reshape American Jewish identity as rediscover its twinned essence. Having done so, he then unhesitantly took upon himself the mantle of American Jews who had come before, from Louis Dembitz back to Jonas Phillips, embodying the spirit of the Constitution for which Phillips had eloquently argued and which George Washington's Constitutional Convention bestowed upon all. Chapter 10. Yeah, Louis Brandeis, interesting character for sure. Chapter 10, we're talking about David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. To grasp how David Ben-Gurion, he lived from 1886 to 1973, and Menachem Begin, who lived from 1913 to 1992, led the people and the state of Israel during their respective lifetimes, it is instructive, though it may seem odd, to begin with how they were buried. Strikingly, both of these two radically different men declined to be interred on Jerusalem's Mount Herzl, the resting place of so many other great heroes, warriors, and statesmen of modern Israel. But the similarities end. Ben-Gurion, along with his wife Paula, was buried in the Negev desert, to which he had retired in whose future prospects he had invested great hopes. His gravestone, aside from his name and the dates of his birth and death, bears only one statement. Immigrated to Palestine in 1906, that phrase is stark but eloquent. For Ben-Gurion, Jewish settlement of the land of Israel, and by implication, the establishment of a Jewish state within it, were transcendent values, embodying both the driving passion of his own life and the enduring import of his legacy. By contrast, Begin requested a place on Jerusalem's Mount of Olives, next to the graves of Moshe Barzani and Meir Feinstein, two young Jewish fighters in pre-state Israel who had been caught and sentenced to death by the British mandatory authorities. In their prison cell, just before their scheduled execution, the two had tightly embraced, detonated a grenade, and died in each other's arms. For Begin, these two young Jews, one of them a Sephardi from Iraq and the other an Ashkenazi from Poland, personified a trio of linked truths, that Jews from anywhere and everywhere are bound by blood. That, too, often their blood has been shed by their enemies, and that Jews themselves must never turn against their fellow Jews. Moreover, this same bond stretched back for generations. In his own choice to lie on the Mount of Olives, Begin was joining centuries of diaspora Jews from around the world who could choose to be buried in the Holy Land, overlooking the site of the ancient temple. In their silence, the two graves thus speak volumes. The Zionism of David Ben-Gurion was driven by, in the Hebrew phrase, Ahavat Eretz Israel, a fierce love for the land of Israel, informed by close study of the Jewish history upon that land. Begin's Zionism, for its part, while no less profoundly connected to the land, was motivated first and foremost by what he would have learned in his childhood to call simply Ahavat Israel, or, in the Ashkenazi pronunciation, Ahavas Yisrael, the love of the Jews and of the Jewish people. A deep respect for their beliefs and a reverence for the covenantal bonds among them. Conceptually, Ben-Gurion's brand of Zionism, shared by many early Zionists, tended to neglect or push aside the 2,000 years of diaspora history, instead leaping in time from the biblical period of national sovereignty and self-government in the land to the modern resuscitation of sovereignty fought for, reclaimed, and renewed. Begin's brand, again, by contrast, lay in a constantly reiterated continuity with the diaspora generations and their stubborn adherence against all odds to their faith, their civilization, and their traditions, including their unfailing historic longing for and expectation of return to the land redeemed. Nothing about the two men's respective childhoods determined this divergence between them. To the contrary, both had been born into long-established Jewish communities in Poland. Ben-Gurion, born David Green in the town of Plonsk, wore as a child the identifying garb of the traditional Jew. Begin grew up in the city of Brest-Litovsk, or Brisk, as it was and is still known to the Jews, a crown jewel of Lithuanian-style orthodoxy. Along with their Judaism, both also imbibed Zionism and modern Hebrew from their families. But here again the similarities end. It was indeed love of the Holy Land that drew Ben-Gurion to emigrate, but in leaving he quite deliberately cast aside most of the rest of his heritage. While he would evolve politically and personally in a variety of deeply considered and powerfully influential ways, little of Plonsk's faith remained. Thus, in references to those of his diaspora contemporaries whom he personally cherished, he would invoke not their religious devotion, but their attachment to and cultivation of the Hebrew tongue. And just as his own Hebraic change of name marked a personal break from the past, he would come to regard the same move as universally essential to the future of the state he was striving mightily to build and the citizenry he was intent on molding. One example, on the morning after the declaration of Israel's independence in May 1948, having duly sworn into the office the commanders of the new state's defense forces, this executive, head of the World Zionist Organization, chairman of the Provisional State Council, founding father, and the first prime minister of the State of Israel, chose to emphasize dramatically one theme and one theme only. Here is Zvi Avalon, Ben-Gurion's deputy chief of staff, would recollect the scene. After the swearing-in ceremony, we all convened for lunch. There, Ben-Gurion stood up and demanded that each of those present immediately change his surname to a Hebrew name and announce his new name on the spot. Some pretty amusing scenes unfolded, but there was no escape. Ben-Gurion turned to each and every one individually and wrote down his new name. Some resisted and asked for more time, but Ben-Gurion good-naturedly pushed them, choose a name or I'll choose one for you. For those who had trouble, he helped. In the afternoon, the state's news outlet already announced the new names of the senior commanders. Cited in Martin Kramer's Ben-Gurion's Army, How the IDF Came into Being and Almost Didn't, Mosaic, February 3rd, 2020. Evidently, for the Israeli Defense Forces to come into existence, just as for Israel itself to instill and to broadcast the message of its independence, marks of the 2,000-year-old diaspora had to be excised from the nation's memory and identity. Such was the characteristic mindset known as Shalat HaGolah, the negation of the Jewish diaspora history, shared by, among others, the leader who did so much to bring the Jewish state into being. As we have already seen, Menachem Begin's course was very different. A Zionist from childhood, he was transformed as a teenager upon attending a speech by Vladimir Jabotinsky, the brilliant and eloquent father of revisionist, non-socialist Zionism, and already a hated rival of Ben-Gurion. That spellbinding experience propelled the young Begin first into the leadership in Poland of Betar, the revisionist Zionist youth movement, and ultimately to leadership of the Irgun, an underground paramilitary organization that would spearhead the revolt against the British in mandated Palestine. To that land, through a long chain of often harrowing experiences, the 29-year-old Begin would arrive in 1942 at the height of World War II as a soldier in the Free Polish Army and would soon go underground. Meanwhile, in Poland, his family in Brisk and so many others whom he held dear were rounded up and murdered by the Nazis. Unlike David Green from Plonsk, this boy from Brisk would never change his name except briefly when adopting a disguise to avoid capture by the British. Throughout his public life as an activist, parliamentarian, prime minister, and statesman, he continued to bear and to invoke the memory of his fellow Briskers. Years later, reflecting on the unspeakable brutalities visited upon his family and his community, he avowed that even though he himself would never go back to Brisk, Brisk will always follow me and be with me, because the three main things I have learned in life were instilled in me there, in sorrow and also in joy, and I have carried them with me from my childhood. They are, love your fellow Jews, do not fear the world's nations. Fortunate is the one who carries with him the yoke of his childhood. David Ben-Gurion will forever remain, after Theodore Herzl, the most important figure, perhaps the indispensable figure, in the birth of the early nurturance of the nation-state of Israel. At the same time, I believe Menachem Begin to be, quite simply, the most important Jewish statesman of the last 500 years, for no other individual has so seamlessly combined power with providence, the Zionist statesmanship of the modern era with the age-old covenantal Jewish worldview. Yeah, you could just imagine having to be faced with the opportunity to have a restored Israel, and it actually come into being, and yeah, just to imagine the age-old covenantal Jewish worldview, but then also to have you got to have modern statesmanship in the sense of, as a new nation, you've got to be prepared for whatever the world throws at you, yet retain your identity. Just tasks, yeah. In what follows, we will compare these two figures in greater depth, citing chapter and verse and pursuing contrasts and clashes between them before arriving at a more rounded and perhaps surprising conclusion. David Ben-Gurion, as historians have noted, Ben-Gurion's true greatness became manifest during the years when the recovery of the Jewish independence, for millennia a shrouded dream, was coming to seem a potentially realizable goal. I'm totally impassioned, he confided to his diary, in that I feel we are on the eve of events liable to change the course of our history, events that have occurred only twice or three times in our 3,000-year history. Henceforth, propelling all of his efforts would be not only this same impassioned resolve to seize the historical moment, but also the vision needed to assure and then to perpetuate the longed for result. In late 1947, as the entire Yeshuv, the Jewish community in pre-state Mandate Palestine, was celebrating the United Nations' approval of a plan to partition the land between a Jewish and Arab state, Ben-Gurion alone soberly pondered what it would take to defend that Jewish state and secure its survival against the massed military might of the region's Arab powers. This drove him single-mindedly to oversee the purchase of the weapons and materials that would turn Israelis' militias, the largest of which was the Haganah, into a modern army. To meet that challenge, the historian Anita Shapira writes, Ben-Gurion had to instigate a conceptual, organizational, and functional revolution. He had to inculcate in the Haganah command the concept that they were an army, not a militia, to redefine the enemy and to build the organizational and command tools for dealing with the new reality. He was haunted by a feeling that time was short and that the very existence of the Yishuv hang in the balance. Wow. A foresight with even more lasting effects may have been Ben-Gurion's grasp of the need to redefine and to expand the territory of the nascent state. Although he is often credited with having cast the crucial vote in the People's Council, ensuring the actual issuance of the state's Declaration of Independence in May 1948, in truth, as the historian Martin Kramer has stressed, the representative leaders of the Yishuv as a whole were well aware that with the fast approaching expiration of the British mandate in Palestine, and with a date certain set for British departure from the land, declaring independence could not and must not be postponed. Rather, in Kramer's view, Ben-Gurion's influence was most critical in convincing his colleagues to strike from the draft declaration any reference to the borders stipulated in the United Nations partition plan, borders that were essentially indefensible, and indeed to omit any definition or any mention of borders altogether. In a meeting of the Zionist executive, Ben-Gurion forcefully put forward his perspective. This is a declaration of independence. For example, there is an American Declaration of Independence. It includes no mention of territorial definitions. There is no need and no law such as that. In a declaration establishing a state, there is no need to specify the territory of the state. Why not mention borders? Because we don't know what will happen. If the UN stands its ground, we won't fight the UN. But if the UN doesn't act and the Arabs wage war against us and we thwart them, when we take the Western Galilee and both sides of the corridor to Jerusalem, all of this will become part of the state if we have sufficient force. Why commit ourselves? And now we have the dispute right up to this day. Ben-Gurion won the argument by a single vote. Today, it is the territorial views held by the party of Menachem Begin, a party that decades later would oversee the relinquishing of the entire Sinai to Egypt, that are conventionally regarded as maximalist. But it was Ben-Gurion who in the late 1940s insisted on borders that were not only defensible in the near term, but adequate to the envisioned state of the future. From this same love for the land of Israel, the land of the Hebrew nation of antiquity, Ben-Gurion also derived his insistence in early April 1948 to defend the city of Jerusalem and rescue its Jews from the clutches of a coordinated Arab blockade. Where the UN had stipulated in its partition plan that the city of Jerusalem would be internationalized, Ben-Gurion, adamantly resolute that it be part of a Jewish state, oversaw the legendary Operation Nashon, a campaign in the battles leading up to independence that broke the Arab siege and resupplied the city's Jews. After the declaration and the 1948-49 war, Ben-Gurion promptly moved the Knesset to Jerusalem. To a UN still clinging to its dream of the city's internationalization, he responded in words that today would no doubt be labeled right-wing. Jewish Jerusalem is an organic, inseparable part of the state of Israel, just as it is an integral part of the Jewish history and belief. Jerusalem is the heart of the state of Israel. We are proud of the fact that Jerusalem is also sacred to other religions and will gladly provide access to their holy places and enable them to worship as and where they please, cooperating with the UN to guarantee this. We cannot imagine, however, that the UN would attempt to sever Jerusalem from the state of Israel or harm Israel's sovereignty in its eternal capital. In subsequent years, Ben-Gurion would supervise the nation's absorption of new immigrants, the creation of government departments, and the imposition of a Hebraic character on every element of the nation's life and identity. That Hebraic character, for him, was itself inextricable from the Hebrew Bible, the book of books, which he read and studied avidly, and knowledge of which he was determined to implant in modern Israeli civic culture. Yeah, my rabbi tells me when his parents moved to Israel in 1961 from New York, and he was born in the early 60s in Israel, but his father insisted they spoke only Hebrew, and it was just a wave of the times. But his mother taught him English on the side, and we now see, years later, it's enabled him to be, Noahide World Center's English, the CEO of the Noahide World Center, but allows him to handle the English component, and all because his mother taught him English. And it's just the story he told me about his father insisting you did everything you did had to be Hebrew, and it was all about establishing that environment in that land as a country for the long term. The identity's got to be established, and this last component was captured amusingly in an official memo sent by the Prime Minister to his finance minister, correcting a pair of Hebrew terms in a routine tax form. Ben-Gurion's memo went as follows: I sign today the document to be filed by a mail. Somebody calling me, and I'm not sure who, but I'm not answering it. Signed today a document to be filed by a male or female worker for the purpose of tax deductions. Paragraph 4 has the phrase, Ba'ali ishti, my husband, my wife. In my opinion, it should say ishti, my man, my woman. In the word Baal, there is an implication of power and idol worship, due in accordance with Hosea the prophet. To explain, there are two words in Hebrew for referring to a husband. The first, Baal, also has other, more negative connotations. In financial or economic context, it can suggest a relationship of power. The second is simply ish. Man, ish, and isha can be rendered as man and woman, but also specifically as husband and wife. Thus, God, in the biblical book of Hosea, speaks of a moment when, as divine spouse, he will be not Israel's Baal, but her tender ish. And thus, in 1953, did the punctilious Prime Minister of Israel rebuke the insensitivity or ignorance of his finance minister. Whether the finance minister complied with or proceeded to disregard the memo, this little episode testifies not only to Ben-Gurion's mastery of the Hebrew Bible, but also to the miracle of the resurrected language itself. As we saw in chapter 8 of this book, even Herzl, who believed that the will of the Jewish people would suffice in and of itself to produce a Zionist movement and a Jewish state, could not conceive that the state's inhabitants would actually speak so recondite a language as Hebrew. But now, 5 years after the birth of the state, an ancient prophet was being cited as an authority in relatively trivial bureaucratic exchange over tax deductions. And we may note an additional irony. that a lyrical passage about the profound love between the personal, providential God and his beloved people should have sprung so immediately to the mind and the pen of a head of state who insistently and emphatically declined to embrace the biblical approach to faith. Not exactly an atheist, Ben-Gurion seems to have adopted Benedict Spinoza's notion of a purposeful universe. If David Ben-Gurion revered the Hebrew Bible, and he did, it was because it formed the literature of the land of Israel, and that selfsame reverence had been visibly at work in the composition of Israel's Declaration of his Independence, which under Ben-Gurion's guardianship and review begins like this. Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values and national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. The traditional Jew might well quibble with his choice of language. Jewish tradition had most often identified not the entry into the land, but the prior covenant at Mount Sinai as the most formative moment in Jewish history, a moment captured and described in the holiest part of the Bible in a passage itself composed before the entry into the land. But the declaration's words do capture the outlook of the leader who, in meeting the Zionist executive, would insist on their appearing as the document's opening statement. Thus, love of the land and its scripture, and the fixed intention is definitely to reestablish Jewish statehood in the land upon the land. These were the motivating forces behind the outlook and the indelible achievements of Israel's first prime minister. But for our purposes, the questions must be asked. Can it likewise be said that, in his life and actions, Ben-Gurion also made manifest a love of the Jewish people, in all of their variety and complexity? And they're coming from all over the world, so you can just imagine different languages, different traditions. It cannot, to the contrary, his hatreds of certain Jews were at times deep, personal, and lasting. For instance, one cannot imagine the lovers of Jews referring to his political opponents with the venom directed by Ben-Gurion at his rival Vladimir Jabotinsky, whom he called Vladimir Hitler. Nor would such biting enmity soften or dissolve even long after his rivals had ceased to present any kind of threat. Jabotinsky himself, while on a Zionist mission in the United States, died of a heart attack in August 1940. Later, during his tenure as prime minister, Ben-Gurion would refuse to honor the clause in Jabotinsky's will asking that his body, in the event of a Jewish state coming into being, and at the invitation of its leader, be interred in the land of Israel. It would take Ben-Gurion's retirement from office before the body could be brought to the Holy Land. Analogous, and despite his own formative role in the creation of Israel's parliamentary system of government, Ben-Gurion could never bring himself to acknowledge the presence in the Knesset of the long-running leader of the main opposition party, instead referring causistically to that peer as the man sitting next to the member of the Knesset Beider. To this man, the object of Ben-Gurion's abhorrence, we can now return. Menachem Begin. At the heart of Menachem Begin's statesmanship, beyond even love of the land, there lay the love of the Jews. Characteristically, in his many speeches to his countrymen, Begin rarely addressed them as Israelis. Rather, he habitually used the word Yehudim, meaning Jews or fellow Jews, and he axiomatically saw himself as first and foremost one such faithful Jew, and Jewish solidarity as central to his identity. In 1977, upon winning the premiership after 30 long years as a member or leader of the opposition in the Knesset, he was asked by a journalist to describe the style in which he intended to conduct his administration. He replied briefly and simply, in the style of a good Jew, or in a good Jewish style. Thus, use of the term Jew, which strictly speaking indicates a descendant of the biblical tribe of Judah, was appropriate in more than one sense. For it was Judah, the son of Jacob, who originally united all the future tribes of ancient Israel, when he and his supplicating brothers stood a-tremble before the vizier of Egypt, an august and forbidding personage, unrecognized by them as their own younger brother Joseph, whom they, under Joseph's own leadership, had iniquitously sold into slavery. But when this same vizier then demanded that they hand over to him their baby brother Benjamin, it was none other than the same Judah who stepped forward and said, "Take me instead." To be a Jew, as my grandfather Rabbi Aaron Soloveichik argued, is thus to be intimately bound up in a familial faith whose very name implies responsibility, each for the other, and solidarity with Jews around the world. Only in this context can Begin's leadership of the 1940s revolt against the British mandatory authorities be understood. Indeed, the revolt itself was explicitly undertaken not in the name of the Jews in the Yeshiv, but in the name of the Jews around the world, and especially in Europe. Jews whom Begin asserted Britain had betrayed, flouting the terms of its League of Nations mandate by denying them entry into Palestine and thereby dooming them to death in the Holocaust. In their name, at the conclusion of the war, Begin would argue for and oversee the launch of the revolt against British overlordship, only if one believed that the Jews were one people, responsible for each other, would such an argument, resting as it did on the sacred principle of Jewish solidarity, make cohesive sense. Alas, this belief was not shared by all of Begin's political opponents in the Yeshiv. Today, many rightly see a seminal moment in the Altalena affair. Thank you, the young Levite. When, a month following Israeli independence in May 1948, an Irgun ship bearing weapons landed on the Israeli shore. Begin asked that a certain percentage of the arms go to Irgun fighters in Jerusalem who had not yet been assimilated into the fledgling Israeli Defense Forces. Refusing, Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, who also bore the title of Defense Minister, instead ordered the ship shelled. Begin in turn ordered his own men not to return fire, famously declaring Milchemet Amin Leo Olam Lo, never, even a war among brothers. Perhaps even more extraordinary had been Begin's actions a few years earlier. During the notorious season of 1944, Ben-Gurion's Haganah militia participated with the British in the rounding up and torture of Irgun fighters. At this point, Ben-Gurion was the leader of only one Zionist faction, albeit the largest. Got it, Irgun. He could not yet claim the authority of the government of a Jewish state, nor could he plausibly make the case that rebellion against the British was in itself wrong, for he and his militia, too, would soon join the Irgun in open guerrilla activity against the British Empire. That Haganah activity would include the planning of the July 1946 bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, which then housed the main headquarters of the Mandate regime. An operation originally planned by the Irgun at the explicit behest of the Haganah Command, but immediately denounced by Ben-Gurion and repudiated as a dissident operation. Today, even the historian Anita Shapira, a strong admirer of Ben-Gurion, has written with understatement that his collusion with the British against the Irgun in 1944 was not his finest moment, adding pointedly that he never expressed regret for his actions. Yet then, too, Begin ordered no reprisals. In explaining why, he cited the Talmudic statement that it was sinat hinam, or baseless hatred among fellow Jews, that had brought about Jerusalem's defeat at the hand of the Romans. This passage, perhaps the most moving in the revolt, 1952, his memoir of those days, makes manifest his link to the ever-present past. And strange as it may seem, for we are speaking of Irgun fighters, the decision not to retaliate, which ran counter to the very split of natural resistance, was honored by all of them. It was honored without a single breach to the very end. They were moved by faith, a profound faith that believed the day was not far distant when all the armed camps in Israel would stand and fight shoulder to shoulder against the oppressor. In that hope and with that faith, we said it was worthwhile enduring grievous suffering. And from down the corridors of history, we heard the echo of those other wars, the cursed internecine wars in dying Jerusalem 19 centuries earlier. Not logic, but instinct said cooperatively, no civil war, not at any price. Statesmen, leaders, and great figures of history are usually remembered for what they achieved. But one lesson here is that often their greatest moments may lie in what they have chosen not to do. All of George Washington's political achievements, and they were impressive indeed, pale in comparison with his 1783 insistence at the height of his fame on resigning his commission as commander-in-chief and retiring from public life. The significance of this self-effacing withdrawal from the scene by the country's singular dominant leader, thereby at a stroke clearing the field for others, was rightly understood by his enemy King George III. If he does that, the British monarchy purportedly said upon learning of Washington's intention, he will be the greatest man in the world. Similarly, just as Menachem Begin is rightly remembered for what he did in the 1940s rebelling against the British, in the late 1970s forging a groundbreaking peace with Egypt, in 1982 destroying the Iraq nuclear reactor, Begin himself, after retiring from political life, reflected that he had hoped to be remembered first and foremost for having prevented a civil war defined by him as the dreaded catastrophe of catastrophes. This union with Jews in the present paralleled a connection with those in the past. From the moment of Israel's birth, Begin stressed the need to incorporate the values of Jewish tradition in the country's public life, a duty owed to the multitude of Jews throughout history whose spirits were very much present in the state that embodied a fulfillment of their own millennial yearnings. The establishment of the state had been declared by Ben-Gurion on a Friday afternoon, just before the onset of the Sabbath. The next night, after the Sabbath's conclusion, the heretofore disguised leader of the Irgun emerged from hiding. In a radio broadcast, Begin announced that his revolt was over and that his organization's forces would become part of the national army. Begin's address was noteworthy for more than one reason. For one thing, he opened with the traditional Sheheyenu prayer, expressing gratitude to God for having kept his people in life and enabled them to reach this momentous hour. For another, where the declaration cited the Holocaust as further testimony to the urgent need for a Jewish state, Begin spoke to the murdered millions as beacons and pole stars, whose spirit lived alongside those now engaged in the desperate struggle against 5 invading Arab armies to secure the Jewish state's existence and the Jewish people's revival. We shall go our way into battle, soldiers of the Lord of hosts, inspired by the spirit of our ancient heroes, from the conquerors of Canaan to the rebels of Judah. We shall be accompanied by the spirit of those who revived our nation, by the spirit of the heroes of the British gallows, the conquerors of death, and by the spirit of millions of our martyrs, our ancestors tortured and buried for their faith, our murdered fathers and butchered mothers, our murdered brothers and strangled children. And in this battle we shall break the enemy and bring salvation to our people, tried in the furnace of persecution, thirsting only for freedom, for righteousness, and for justice. Whoa, what a profound statement. These are examples of what I have in mind in identifying Begin's worldview as a prime model of covenantal Zionism, an encompassing approach to Jewish history that differed profoundly from that of many other Zionist leaders. In the Bible, it was the covenant with God at Mount Sinai, a covenant struck by the people of Israel before entering the land, that in the words of Moses created a metaphysical bond between those who are here today and those who are not here today. From Deuteronomy 29:15. As a Jew who lived in communion at once with the past and with posterity, Begin would reject all the predilection of the military secular labor Zionist elite, Ben-Gurion prominently among them, for ignoring, if not effectively expunging, the heritage of 2,000 years of exilic existence and denying it any role in the formation of Israeli identity or any place in Israeli textbooks. For Begin, the battle to regain and to preserve Jewish independence had to be imbued with a properly large element of informed gratitude to those who had gone before, and especially to those whose dreams had been violently deferred by murderers. For him, too, that communion must be allowed to influence and help define the present. A Jewish state, embarrassed by its diaspora ancestors, distant from its heritage, and unwilling to reflect in its culture and public life, would not truly be a Jewish state. Thus, in November 1977, when Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, seeking peace, offered to visit Israel in person and suggested arriving on a Saturday, Begin insisted that he not arrive till Saturday night, and even then at a late enough hour to allow preparations for the event to be made after the Sabbath's conclusion. In the Knesset, as described by his speechwriter Yehuda Avner, Begin explains his reasons. I wanted the whole world to know that ours is a Jewish state which honors the Sabbath day. I read again those eternal biblical verses. Honor the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, and was again deeply moved by their meaning. These words echo one of the most sanctified ideas in the history of mankind. We ask all nations to respect our day of rest. They will do so only if we respect it ourselves. Emphasis added. In truth, this aspect of national self-respect was in need of bolstering, and the task was not easy. One significant internal debate took place in the early 1980s when Prime Minister Begin insisted that El Al, the national airline, refrain from flying on the Sabbath. Threats of a shutdown were issued by El Al's unions, to whose members and political supporters he responded in the Knesset. Let me say this to you, good workers of El Al. We cannot engage in profit and loss calculations when it comes to the internal heritage of the Jewish people. There is no way of assessing the religious, national, social, historical, and ethical values of the Sabbath day by the yardstick of financial loss or gain. As this house should know, it is not necessary to be a religiously observant Jew to appreciate the full historic and sacred aura that enshrines the perfect gift, called Sabbath. Its prohibitions are not arbitrary. They provide insulation against corrosive everydayness, they build fences against invasions by the profane, and they enrich the soul by creating a space for sacred time. One need not be pious to accept the cherished principles of Shabbat. One merely needs to be a proud Jew. Ben-Gurion and the Providence of Jewish history. We are now able to appreciate better the profound contrast between the perspectives of David Ben-Gurion and Menachem Begin. The National Library of Israel contains in its archives a remarkable correspondence between Ben-Gurion and the philosopher Hugo Bergman. In it, Ben-Gurion denies the notion that human beings are made in the image of their creator, and then adds the following. It may seem strange that I write this immediately following Yom Kippur, after joining a company of paratroopers holding the Yom Kippur prayer service in one of the shacks here in the Kibbutz Sde Boker, Ben-Gurion's retirement home, all evening yesterday and nearly the entire day today. I listened to the prayers and contemplated them. I could feel the devotion of the few people who believed in what they were saying, and I felt respect and fondness for them, but I did not envy them. Prayer may feel pleasant, yet it is not reality, but self-deception. Prayer is self-deception? One can hardly conceive of a notion more foreign to Menachem Begin's public or private persona. In a 1972 memorial tribute to the annihilated Jewish community of Brisk, delivered before an audience of survivors and descendants, Begin, like Ben-Gurion, invoked the Yom Kippur prayers. But unlike Ben-Gurion, he stressed how the day's liturgy bound him and his fellow Briskers to God, and also critically to Jerusalem, the site of the temple and the priestly service. There are, he said, still days or nights when every one of us is still in the city of our youth. But what is that city? Although in a literal sense we all come from Brisk, spiritually we were all born in Jerusalem. One might put it slightly differently. It was because Menachem Begin was raised in Brisk that he could rightly say that he had been born in Jerusalem. For in that town synagogues were fathers and mothers, sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, neighbors and friends, and multitudes of others worshiping together with their bodies in Brisk and their loyal, longing souls in Jerusalem. One of them, standing and facing Jerusalem, was the little boy who would never forget where he had once stood, and who one day, as a leader of his people, would constantly remind them that honoring Zionism and its achievements meant honoring the dreams and the lives of those loved and lost. This is the essence of Begin's covenantal Zionism. Love the Jewish people, do not fear the nations, and remember that fortunate are those who bear with them the yoke of their children. Begin's commemoration of Yom Kippur in Brisks is a reminder of Israel's unique national responsibility not only to act to secure the safety of the Jewish people, but also to preserve the vision of those who come before and those who died before there was in Israel to protect them. Should the Jewish state fail to do so, its debt to the past will remain unpaid. Should it succeed, those who died will, in a certain sense, still live. And marvelous to say, in much of the culture of present-day Israel, Begin's vision lives. This is a universal and embracing Jewish culture, as much Sephardi and Mizrahi, or as Ashkenazi, and to a large extent a union of all three. It is also a much more religious culture than Israel's early founders could have ever imagined. In Israel today, some of the land's most famous singers and entertainers enthrall audiences of all complexions and convictions with music based on the words, the poetries, and the melody of the traditional liturgy as observed in the most far-flung communities. This cultural profoundly reflects a sense of the nation's responsibilities to the past as well as to the future. Amen. In all of this, one can see with one's own eyes, hear with one's own ears, and feel with one's own soul the Israel that Menachem Begin, lover of the Jewish people, helped to found. Here, perhaps, is one of the most striking ironies of modern Jewish history. It was David Ben-Gurion who, above all the leaders of 1948, ensured Israel's creation and survival. But the Israeli society that exists today reflects more saliently the covenantal Zionism of Menachem Begin. To those, moreover, who find Israel's story impossible to explain without resorting to the miraculous, this irony may itself rank among the greatest of miracles. For one can perhaps see in the singular, definitive role played by David Ben-Gurion, who emerged with all his flaws to shepherd the birth of the Jewish state and profoundly influence its flourishing, evidence for the God whose providential purposes Ben-Gurion himself doubted, and whose existence Menachem Begin ardently believed. Conclusion. I think we can try and finish some of this. Lessons in Jewish leadership. Let's run this out till the end of today's session. What then does Jewish tradition have to say about the nature of statecraft? While any general study of that topic rightly compels interest, encountering the political personalities explored in this volume may reveal a number of themes unlikely to be found, if present at all, in the lives of the celebrated political leaders at large. Indeed, as the book's chapters proceed chronologically through the centuries, certain threads emerge that bind together the careers, challenges, and accomplishments of the leaders being portrayed, despite the distances in time among them. It would appear that from our 10 chapters, 5 such threads or themes reveal themselves. First, a balance between humility and majesty. As I noted, citing the historian Andrew Roberts, the great statesmen of European history were not known for their humility. By contrast, the scripturally inspired leader is obligated to epitomize a complex dialectical approach to political activity. The Bible, as we have seen, enjoins leaders to see themselves as both actors and acted upon. Immersed in a multifaceted political chess game, while simultaneously conceiving themselves as pawns in God's heavenly hand. This dialectic is particularly pronounced, though in different ways, in the careers of David and of Esther. The former figure, as depicted in the book of Samuel and Psalms, is an assertive, if not aggressive, actor on the historical stage, even as he frequently emphasizes that his achievements have been brought not truly by him, but by God. This same duality can be seen in the often surprising aspect of David's political decisions, characterized at times by alacrity, courage, and audacity, while at other times, as in his decline to kill either Saul or later Saul's rebellious kinsman Shimei, by a readiness to let God's providential plan unfold as it will without his personal involvement. For its part, the book of Esther describes a woman who, in her role as queen, is informed by her cousin Mordecai that she has been placed by divine providence precisely to act heroically. As we cited his words in the introduction, who knows, perhaps you arose to the throne for exactly this moment. In acting, however, she proceeds by rejecting Mordecai's strategic advice in favor of a plan of her own, thereby majestically exhibiting her freedom and independence. Years later, another great Jewish queen, Shlomshion, made manifest another fascinating fusion of faith and statecraft in her profound partnership with rabbinic leadership and her own gifted political acumen. This biblically infused tension between majesty and humility is rarely paralleled in the stories of non-Jewish political leaders. Although notably, one can perhaps discern signs of it during certain extraordinary instances in the lives of American presidents, itself a possible testament to the impact of the Hebrew Bible on American political consciousness. I think that means the second theme is linked to a paradox. Most historical examples of superior statecraft have emerged from within the framework of a functioning polity, and the practitioners usually present at a state represent a state. Yet for 2,000 years, the most admirable Jewish leaders represented a people whose state had been destroyed, but whose national identity remained firmly in place. Not only did Jews continue to regard themselves as a nation, the nation founded at Sinai, but their host governments in the diaspora also regularly identified them as such. Thus, the central issue at the heart of Esther's story concerns the nature of the Jewish nationhood and its protection in the wake of the first exile in Jewish history. Later on, in Roman times, the monumental task undertaken by Yochanan ben Zakkai is to prepare for a national future at a juncture when any near term possibly of restored independence has suddenly and calamitously evaporated. In the late 15th century, it falls to Isaac Abravanel to negotiate for the Jewish life nation in Spain in the face of the decision by Ferdinand and Isabella to expel the Jews en masse after the Inquisition. Similarly, in the mid-17th century, with the mission of Manasseh ben Israel, they're like an ethno-religious system, the young Levite brings forth a point. Similarly, in the mid-17th century, with the mission of Manasseh ben Israel to win the restoration of the Jews to England, or in the mid-19th century, as noted in Chapter 8, with Mordecai Manuel Noah's daring scheme to secure the Jewish presence in America as prologue to a Zionist return to the Holy Land, and later with Louis Brandeis' bold acts on behalf of the Balfour Declaration. The third theme arises from the second. A stateless Jewish people not only remained a nation, but also dreamt persistently of the revival and reincarnation of its lost sovereignty. Correlatively, Jewish leadership at its best, and not just in the modern age, has often reflected on how such a vision might be realized. Thus, Theodor Herzl was not alone in devoting deep thought and brilliant action to what might bring about such a return and revival, nor was Louis Brandeis alone in helping to advance that return by following, albeit in his different way, the prior American example of Mordecai Manuel Noah. In England, indeed, a longer and perhaps more direct historical line might be drawn back in time from the British government's 1917 issuance of the Balfour Declaration to the efforts of Manasseh ben Israel to restore British Jewry over the reign of Oliver Cromwell. This book, drawing on Rabbi Joseph Soloveichik and Yaakov Herzog, has presented the case for an even longer-term chain of events, connecting the achievements of modern Zionism all the way back to the revitalizing vision of Yochanan ben Zakkai. Our fourth theme arises from its predecessor, or rather from its predecessors. It concerns the ability of Jewish leaders and one baptized Jew to cultivate and eloquently to express pride in the permanently resonant teachings of the Jewish faith and the stubbornly resilient record of Jewish physical endurance, even in settings where Judaism has been widely derided and Jewish life desperately endangered. As Isaac Abravanel in exile devoted himself to a deep, if seemingly irrelevant, study of political thought in the Hebrew Bible, Manasseh ben Israel emerged as the most famous Jewish public intellectual on earth thanks to his audacious defense, in Spanish and Latin, all the Judaism proclaimed to the world. Benjamin Disraeli, baptized as an Anglican at the age of 12, could easily have advanced his political career by disparaging Jewish tradition and defaming the Jewish people, as his own father did. Instead, he chose repeatedly and vocally to remind his countrymen of the permanent debt owed by Christianity and Western civilization to the religious, moral, legal, and political teachings of ancient Judaism. Permanent debt. Ideas placed at the heart of his own political rhetoric and his literary activity alike, most notably in his 1847 novel Tancred, where the case is made for the probability of a Jewish return to the Holy Land. It is the realization of yes, for sure. My rabbi spoke. My rabbi's rabbi, who recently passed late last year, at the late age of 90, he was himself was a student of Rabbi Kook, the young Levite. So yeah, interesting to hear Deep thoughts, profound, just boggle the mind. Okay, it's not the realization of Tancred's predictions that bring us to our final theme. The story of the modern-day Jewish return to the Holy Land is altogether unparalleled in the history of the world, and entailed within it is an equally unique story of Jewish leadership. Yet, one key part of this monumental achievement owed to the ability of modern leaders to connect themselves to the events of the Jewish past, and in the Jewish land that stretched back thousands of years, and to commune with figures who had lived long ago. In a scene from the epic movie Patton, 1970, U.S. General Omar Bradley is both startled and amused as U.S. General George Patton cites and recalls in detail, as if it happened only yesterday, an assault by 3 Roman legions on the Carthaginians in Morocco thousands of years earlier. For Bradley, the very ability to recount and to re-experience this event marks Patton as a one-of-a-kind oddball. Winston Churchill, for his part, would no doubt have appreciated Patton's performance, yet Churchill's own rhetorically powerful writings on the English past do not often reach back earlier than 1415, Battle of Agincourt, or further into the mists of the landing of William the Conqueror on English soil in the year 1066. More recent by millennia than the time of King David of Israel. By contrast, those who helped shepherd modern Israel into being were profoundly connected to the very distant past in a way that was elemental to their leadership. The record of David Ben-Gurion's lectures and correspondence, not to mention his transparent and often voiced love of the land and the Hebrew language, makes it clear that ancient Israel's monarchs and prophets were as alive to him as if they were his contemporaries. Mindset. Yep, it's a way to live in this world. Yeah, you know, how you think really affects the way you function, for sure. Similarly, Menachem Begin would speak of Israel's capital as Jerusalem, D.C. David's city, and in the 1940s would launch his revolt against the British mandate by invoking the spirit of the Maccabees, even as he also reminded contemporaries that Jews must draw inspiration not only from the Davids, but also from the Ben Zakkais, not only from those who lived in ancient independent Jerusalem, but also from those who, centuries after century, indomitably refused to forget Jerusalem. This ability to connect to the past, Begin insisted, was imbibed from generation to generation, forged in a humble Jewish homes, taught by parents to children, creating a covenantal memory unlike that of any other nation. So true. Thus it was that, in speaking from the White House at the festive 1978 celebration of the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt, a moment regarded by many as marking the summit of his statesmanship, Prime Minister Begin chose not to focus on himself or even on those who had fought to create modern Israel, but on all those who had come before. This is the proper place, the appropriate time to bring back to memory the song and the prayer of thanksgiving I learned as a child in the home of my father and mother, that doesn't exist anymore because they were among the 6 million people, men, women, and children, who sanctified the Lord's name with their sacred blood, which reddened the rivers of Europe from the Rhine to the Danube, from the Bug to the Volga, only because they were born Jews and because they didn't have a country of their own or a valiant Jewish army to defend them, and because nobody came to their rescue, although they cried out, save us, de profundis, from the depths of the pit and the agony. That prayer is the Song of Degrees, written 2 millennia and 500 years ago, when our forefathers returned from their first exile to Jerusalem, to Zion. Whereupon Begin placed a skull cap on his head and recited in Hebrew Psalm 126, sung by so many throughout Jewish history. When the Lord restored the captivity of Zion, we were like dreamers. Jewish leaders, at their best, draw on the spirit of the people they lead, the generations whose legacies they inherit and inhabit. The remarkable stories of power and providence described in this book and the resurrection of the state of Israel vindicate that same ageless spirit represented in the strivings and the yearnings of the Jewish people, their rootedness in a land, in a family, and in the faithful belief that in the end, David still lives. Whoa, what a statement. One can only pray that present and future generations of the Jewish people will continue to prove worthy of such leaders of vision. And one can only hope for further examples of providence yet to come. Wow. What a way to end it. Whoa, that was just a profound book. I love the way he pulled that out in the end. But yeah, this is Rabbi Meir Soloveichik, who is in his 40s, lives in the Chicago area. Wonderful gentleman who's descended from the well-known Rabbi Soloveichik. Point being, obviously, he's learned a lot through his family, but then also from study. And I think he put this together beautifully, leading us through the centuries, all the way from King David up to modern times, showing the connection between divine providence in Hashem's sovereignty over everything and power in this world, and how it played that major role in the great Jewish leaders over millennia. And yeah, just lots of wonderful history there to help understand, especially the formation of the current state of Israel and the tempo and the times, and what it took to stand up against such guff to make things happen. But glad you enjoyed it, Sheila. I hope everybody else has enjoyed it as well. I'll have to try and find something else to come up with for tomorrow. See if we can start a new book. I'll see if I can find something, unless somebody's got some suggestions. I did take some notes down on some of the books that were quoted in here, but I don't know if I want to go back to a different theme. The young Levite says, I'm the Declaration of Independence, we say, in light of the visions of the prophets of Israel, and while we don't use the word God, we do use with confidence in the Rock of Israel. Yes, for sure. For sure. Yeah, as a Benoach, I don't mind saying God, but I try to clarify Almighty God, creator of the universe, so that people don't mistake it with something else. But I don't like to own responsibility for what others might or might not think, though I try to understand that sometimes our actions can affect what others think, and be conscious of it, and fight hard to be pious of the nations, and learn from the beauty of Hebrew tradition, how we as people of the world should function. And if I have questions, I go to my rabbi or a rabbi and see where which the right way, to the left or to the right. But Hashem is great and provides, and I think this book captured the way leaders are bound in their heart to Hashem's providence, and to understand he holds it all together, and you're behooved to function in a fashion that recognizes it, or you're just misunderstanding the world for what it really is. And I think it links together the way providence and power come together beautifully in the lives that he mentioned, the 10 portraits. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. But on that note, we're going to sign out for today. But if somebody's got a suggestion, drop it in the chat box. If I can find it on a Kindle edition, I will see about jumping into it for tomorrow. And we'll jump into a new book, so keep an eye out for that post, and we'll start something fresh and new. But I hope you enjoyed this. I really enjoyed it. Make sure you like the video. Feel free to share it out there on social media as well. A joy to be able to share and even read such works. I started out a little slow, but I'll tell you, I love the way it brought us up to modern day understanding. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. So until tomorrow, have a wonderful, wonderful day, everybody. Bye for now.